scene, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, the truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everyone, welcome back. A few days ago we did an interesting show with a historian about the 1990s. Terry H. Anderson has a new book out, Why the 90s Matter. And in my conversation with Anderson, I hope you all saw it, we talked about NAFTA and its impact on the 90s, representing a kind of conceptual middle point, high point, low point, depending how you see it. And of course, resulting at the end of the 90s, a kind of end moment, appropriately, the 1999 Seattle WTO, World Trade Organization protests. Those protests, as it happens, have been put into an interesting oral history. 1 week to Change the World by my guest today, D.W. Gibson. I was going to say Griffith, but of course that would be a Freudian error. D.W., congratulations on the new book. To what extent, in your view, are these 1999 World Trade Organization protests, do they represent not just literally, but the symbolic end to the 1990s?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think symbolically and sort of functionally, they were, you know, the biggest protest you've seen in the U.S. 50,000 people. It was a protest that stated a goal to shut down the World Trade Organization meetings, and it met that goal. What other protest movements can we say that they set a goal and they met that goal in the last 50 years, you know, since the civil rights era in American context? So I think it was a major moment, and there was a lot of energy coming out of that moment in terms of organizing and keeping the campaign going. In 2000, saw a lot of that activity continue, but then of course, the work that was being done hit a wall called 9/11, which sort of rerouted a lot of the organizing efforts into anti-war movements. But what they set out to accomplish in 1999 was major, and they accomplished it, and it left a big impact on the World Trade Organization and its trajectory over the 25 years since then.
D.W., in my conversation with Anderson, he quotes a couple of people about the 90s. One conservative critic who described it as the most inconsequential decade, and then Kurt Anderson, the progressive journalist, who describes it as the most fun decade. I'm guessing for you and for many of the people who you spoke to for your oral history of the protests against the World Trade Organization, that the 90s was neither. It was certainly consequential, but it wasn't a lot of fun. How would you summarize the 90s as a decade in terms of the run-up to these protests?
I think atmospherically, especially as you get into the late 90s and you get to the protest in Seattle, I mean, let's remember we're at this point weeks away from turnover to a new millennium. So it was really a time, I think, of a lot of excitement, a lot of angst too, a lot of anxiety. I mean, transport yourself back to that time period and how much people were obsessed with the idea of Y2K, right? And the idea of computers turning over, and would that lead to all kinds of chaos? That was sort of, you know, infiltrating people's sort of psyches, I think. And we had things like fight clubs going on around the country, right? People sort of trying to figure out a way to channel the energy and the angst that was in the air. So I think there was that weird mixture of, I would say, excitement and angst that was coming to a head. And I think that the decade itself, you know, really was wildly disappointing. I mean, this is the decade where the Clinton administration brings the sort of Democratic Party over to the sort of Reagan way of seeing things. And we really start to lose the sort of FDR New Deal framework, social safety net, civil society. All of these things start to go more toward a neoliberal point of view as Clinton administration brings the Democratic Party into sort of the Republican sphere, if you will. And I think we're still living with those consequences. I think that continued with other Democratic administrations since then, and we've only continued more in that direction. I think we can look back at it as a very, very disappointing moment that way.
Well, that's why the 90s matter, at least for D.W. Gibson. What about NAFTA, D.W.? How critical was it? It was signed by the leaders of Canada, the US, and Mexico in 1994. It's become the thing that not just the left, but the Trumpian right now sees as the root of all evil. For you, how important was the signing of NAFTA in 94?
Yeah, that was so much. NAFTA was so much of this sort of brew that we're talking about in the 90s, because it really did diminish sort of the place of unions and workers in terms of figuring out new world order. I think there are a lot of people in Seattle that were making the point, look, it's not about anti-globalization. It's not about anti-globalization. It's about a globalization that works for individual human beings and isn't written by corporate entities sort of making all the rules and enforcing all the rules, right? And so we see that the beginning of that with NAFTA. It's nation states coming together, deciding sort of how the chess pieces are going to be moved about. And unions and workers really don't have consult on that. Unions didn't get the legal consult they were supposed to get on the NAFTA signing. They really sort of rushed that through. So, and that's where you see a lot of the energy coming in Seattle. That's how you're able to get, steel workers and AFL-CIO and Teamsters marching side by side with environmentalists, groups that they were previously sort of been butting heads with, because there were so many ways in to sort of getting upset with WTO and the way globalization was happening. You could come from so many different angles, from debt relief, from labor, from environment, for so many ways into sort of caring about this. Seed patenting, right? We had Vandana Shiva from India there. She was talking about seed patenting and sort of the big companies starting to ramp up those efforts. So it's a big tent coalition that we see in NAFTA, and the after effects of that help build that big tent and all of the energy that was there.
DW wrote a book called 14 Miles, Building the Border Wall, a book about Trump's attempt to build the wall. Was the movement that came out of this opposition to NAFTA and the free trade deal put together by Clinton and the people who run Canada and Mexico, was it anti-immigrant?
Yes, absolutely. Because consider this. So consider you referenced my book, 14 Miles. I was looking at a stretch of the U.S. border from the Pacific Ocean to the Otay Mesa Desert in California. You have already 2 border crossings in that 14-mile stretch, right? And there was a place in the desert about 6 years ago now where the Trump administration was building 8 prototypes of a border wall that they were going to sort of audition and do one of the best models. All of that sort of got thrown out and none of it was used. But in that space in the desert where they were building those 8 prototypes of a border wall, once they tore them down, what did they build in that space? They built a port of entry. They didn't build a wall, they built a port of entry, a way to bring goods into the country. And it was a commercial port of entry. That's what's important. It was all about bringing goods from all of the factories in Mexico, the maquiladoras right on the border, bringing those goods into the US, finding a way to do more of that, right? So we're constantly finding ways to bring goods, products into the country. But yet the people who make those products just a few miles across the border can't come into the country. So we found all kinds of ways to let products flow freely between countries, but the people who make them possible, human beings, no, they can't travel. So consider the fact that humans don't have the same sort of opportunities of the products that they make. That's really perverse in some ways. And I think that that's where you start to see with NAFTA and with some of the efforts the Clinton administration put forward alongside NAFTA, like Operation Gatekeeper, which was a big push to ramp up border patrol, ramp up enforcement, and a lot of the casual crossing that had happened before, even day laborers that would often go across the border to work in the US all day and then go home at night. That stuff went away because it wasn't possible anymore. It was keep the work in Mexico where we can pay a fraction of the price and send the goods to the US and stop letting the people come in. So you definitely have a lot of anti-immigrant energy in this sort of push towards globalization that comes up in the 1990s. And that continues with Trump now in his critique of WTO and globalization. It has a very xenophobic ring to it, right? A very anti-immigrant element to it.
The events that you write about in your new oral history, the 1999 Seattle World Trade Organization protests, caught some people, especially I think liberal globalizers, by surprise, and still perhaps in some ways does. Where did the intellectual origins of this come from? I know for your oral history, you interview some of the iconic leftists of the 90s, still around today, men like Noam Chomsky and Ralph Nader, who's been on the show. Would it be fair to say that this was a intellectually trickle-down movement from people like Chomsky and Nader, or was it more democratically spirited?
That's a really good and hard question, because there were different factions that came together to make these protests possible. 50,000 people. So you've got people coming from, as I said earlier, very different angles. And so you've got, let's say, big contingencies of unions, right? Very hierarchical structures, right? But then you've got a lot of groups like environmentalists, like some anarchists, I mean, sort of lowercase a, sort of political anarchists, who are not as organized and not into the hierarchical structures. So there was something that developed in Seattle called the Direct Action Network, was really sort of ad hoc sort of piecing together of small organizations, individual players who all came together and wanted to shut down the meetings, right? And so those people are working in a very non-hierarchical way and sort of pride themselves on working in a leaderless way. And they had a very defined structure to this leaderless approach. There were affinity groups, a model born out of the Spanish Civil War, where people organized in groups of 15 to 20 to decide how they were going to participate in the protest. There was a spokes council. There was a physical space the warehouse they rented so they could meet, and a spokes council could meet. And one person was chosen from every affinity group to represent the group in the spokes council so the decisions could be made. So very democratic, very horizontal in terms of the decision making for one big facet of the protest. And I think that's really important. Now, when you say that there's a leaderless movement, what that really means, and John Nichols says this in the book, it's that there are really a lot of leaders, right? A lot of people take on responsibility. So I wouldn't say trickle down. I think there were people like Ralph Nader, certainly was a big player, and he sent teams and he sent resources to Seattle to make sure that there was a big protest. And that was a major element. And he was already sort of waxing on about the myth of free markets and how that was something we'd been sold and hoodwinked into believing in. And he got that message out there, and that was a big part of it. But there were other people that were being leaders in very different ways in terms of organizing soup kitchens or organizing cultural elements that would be part of the protest, big puppets or marching bands, right? So many people came together in so many different ways to make it happen. That's one of the things that was so magical about it. And it's also one of the things that makes it really hard to sort of reproduce, right? That sort of magic, that sort of leaderless environment where so many people were able to come together in a horizontal way.
Yeah, the way you're describing it, it does sound like a Janus-faced movement, which is appropriate given it happened on the verge of the new century. On the one hand, it was a movement that reflected the traditional leftist ideas of men like Noam Chomsky and Ralph Nader. On the other hand, it predicted not just the decentered technological idealism of Web3, but also of the Occupy movement and even of the protests today. What's your sense, DW, of the legacy of this movement intellectually?
The legacy of Seattle is so wildly underestimated. So Seattle, let's say, like sort of intellectually, but practically too. And those things are sort of intertwined, I think. So think about it. Seattle is where you get people's microphone, call and response, right? Which is a very powerful thing out in the field. Seattle in American context is where you first get the internet as an organizing tool, part of the picture, right? It's where you get the militarization of police departments in the US, right? It's where you get these big tent coalitions. All of this stuff is coming. It's where you get Occupy tactics. All of this is coming out of Seattle, right? And so that's one of the reasons I think it's so remarkable that this has been sort of forgotten over the last 25 years. And we remember Occupy to a certain extent, but again, Occupy didn't set out practical goals and meet them the way they did in Seattle. So I think that's really important to point out those ways that Seattle's fingerprints are all over protest movements that have been in the US over the course of the last 25 years. And I think intellectually, absolutely. I mean, you can trace lineages. First of all, it's very easy to see how Ralph Nader's ill-fated 2000 presidential run was very much an extension of what was created in Seattle. The sort of upset and anger at corporate governance that you saw was the foundation for Ralph Nader's presidential run, which was, again, ill-fated and consequential in 2000. I think you can even trace the lineage between what happened in Seattle and after that with the financial crisis and Occupy and Bernie Sanders, his rise in politics, right, to national prominence, right? He was doing his thing in a sort of regional way, but I think what you get is an opening up to a notion of another way to create world order, right? Especially in the American context, where we're preoccupied with private property and land ownership and sort of late stage capitalism. These figures open up a way to reconsider the world and reconsider how we order the world. That's exciting. That was exciting in Seattle. And as tumultuous as today's world is, it's still exciting. And someone like Bernie Sanders and the movement he's brought and the younger generations he's inspired, so it's a continuation of that intellectual tradition, I think.
We're speaking with D.W. Gibson, the author of an interesting important new oral history, 1 Week to Change the World, an oral history of the 1999 Seattle World Trade Organization protests. I want to remind everyone that great guests like D.W. are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a new quarterly based on old principles of words and print, about culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with DW to talk more about the 1999 World Trade Organization protest. Don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought, a quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with D.W. Gibson, the author of 1 Week, an oral history, and 1 Week to Change the World, about the 1999 World Trade Organization protests in Seattle. Of course, when we think of this title, D.W., I assume you borrowed it in some way or other from John Reed's great book on the Russian Revolution, 10 Days That Shook the World. Some people might say, watching this, well, Reed was describing really ultimately a catastrophic event. The Bolsheviks took power, millions of dead as a consequence. Why would you want to borrow that title? Is there a connection between the 1 Week to Change the World that you have written about and spoken about in this book and the Bolshevik Revolution, perhaps in its failures and tragedy?
I don't think there's necessarily like a direct connections. I think it's more about the sort of nature of what can happen when a moment is created. And a moment was created in Seattle that felt surreal and felt overwhelming in some ways and felt powerful in a lot of ways to the 50,000 people that were there. And there's something sort of, again, unpredictable to when those moments can arise or be created by a handful of individuals that want to drive a moment and make something of it. And so I think it's sort of that energy of all these people coming together and having that thought that they could make a difference. I mean, that again is tapping into that time frame of 1999 and people dealing with the anxieties of that and the excitement of that turnover to the new millennium. And it felt like people that I interviewed talked about how it felt like a time where we could start over. You know, we could create a new beginning. We could find new ways to organize the world. And I think that sort of in that sort of more grandiose sort of thinking, in that energy of a created moment, I think there you find a parallel, right? And those are the sort of the blips on the radar as we look back sort of at our historical timelines, those moments that arise that are magical. You want to look back at the ingredients that went into them and understand them as best you can, how those moments were created.
You talk about them being magical, but when you look at the Wikipedia page, for example, for the World Trade Organization protest, there's a picture of a police officer spraying pepper spray at the crowd. Was it quite terrifying too? And is its legacy in some ways the violence of the police and perhaps the violence of the demonstrators?
Yeah, it was. I think it was terrifying. People have, you know, I learned so much working on this book, and there are so many parallels to today's world. It's remarkable. But beyond that, it's a damn engaging story. From beginning to end, it's really quite a riveting story. It was week-long protests, and every day there were major events, and some of them were absolutely terrifying. Let's remember that the police department ran out of tear gas on the second day and had to ask the FBI to fly in new supplies from Colorado, which they did by jet in a matter of hours.
Ever incompetent, the U.S. police force.
Exactly. And so
they weren't sorry to interrupt, DW, but so the authorities themselves, the police, the politicians, were they not expecting violence?
They were not. Well, so it depends on what you say when we talk about law enforcement or police, because there were so many layers. There was the Seattle Police Department, there was the Sheriff's Department, there was the state troopers. And then because President Clinton was going to be there, there was also the FBI and the Secret Service. So you have all these layers of law enforcement, and the primary layer, the police department, which had the primary responsibility, the leadership there, as well as the mayor of Seattle, they were caught off guard. They had an ill-fated dream that they could let the World Trade Organization have their meetings and also let all the protesters do what they wanted to do. And they wanted both of those things to happen. And they both couldn't happen, because the protesters' goal was to shut down the meeting. And so it was incongruous. And the police department and the mayor were sort of lying to themselves about that. And over the course of the week, as things became more serious, other law enforcement offices sort of took over. And especially as Clinton's visit approached, the Secret Service and FBI took over and really made local law enforcement take back the streets and become more violent with the protesters. And I think, you ask about violence. I think violence is one of the most tricky parts to talk about when we talk about Seattle, because I think that's what it's remembered for. If anyone does remember it, they're like, oh yeah, a bunch of people smashed windows, right? And there was a bunch of tear gas. And those things happened. There was a bunch of tear gas.
Yeah, it was known. I mean, according to Wikipedia, it's often referred to as the Battle of Seattle.
Exactly. So you have police reacting in this strong way because they were caught on their heels. They weren't expecting the volume of people and the sort of fight within the people. And when I say fight, I don't mean actual violence, but I mean their determination. So they underestimated that, and they're overreacting. And then what you also had is you had one small contingent of protesters. Everyone I spoke to estimated about 50 people who called themselves the Black Bloc. That's how they sort of organized. They put masks over their face, and they smashed windows at stores, Starbucks, and tried to go to Nike Town and smash all the windows. And that was their way of protesting. But the thing is, all the other people that were there, the other 50,000 people that were there, did not want to do that. They were all committed to nonviolent civil disobedience. And so when those 50 protesters started smashing windows, that became the story in the media. And I think one of the things we learned in Seattle, and we're seeing again in today's world, is that the media continues to fail us in terms of telling us the story, right? So the story switches from being about globalization and the World Trade Organization and workers and environmental concerns and all of these things, and it becomes about 50 people that smashed windows, right? Because those become the best pictures to put on the evening news. Those are the best pictures to put in the newspapers. But what also happened was hundreds of protesters linked arms around stores that they really hated, so that the Black Bloc could not come and smash the windows, and they protected those stores. The next morning, several protesters got trash bags, brooms, dustpans, and swept up a lot of the mess so that it wasn't there anymore. That story wasn't reported by the media, right? So it's so tempting for the media to go to the shiny object and tell that story, and I don't think we can avoid doing that. But do we have the capacity to tell two stories at once? Can we tell the story of windows that were smashed one afternoon, but also tell the story of how 50,000 people blocked 13 intersections so that one of the most powerful international organizations in the world couldn't hold their meetings and reach a new agreement? Can we tell that story too? We have to be able to tell two stories at once. We see this now with Gaza pro-Palestinian protest, right? I was at Columbia University several weeks ago when things were going on. I saw what was happening there. Yeah, there were hot spots, but there were also people sitting in tents talking, reading, having lunch, listening to music, right? So we have to be able to tell both of those stories at once, and we can see that the media still doesn't have the capacity to do that. And I think that's one of the biggest things we learned in Seattle. And you know, the protesters were well organized, trying to take control of the media as best they could. They established an independent media center. This is the first time people can sort of go out with audio devices or cameras on their own and try to tell their own story, and they can try to feed those stories into traditional media outlets, right? Evening news and so forth. And they were well organized in doing that. That's where you get Democracy Now! And independent media centers. They're all coming out of Seattle movement. That's another part of the legacy of Seattle.
Could conservatives, though, DW say the same thing? I don't know about January 6th, for example. Oh, there were a few violent extremists carrying Confederate flags, but most of us were really concerned about the results of the election, or even say the same about events in Charlottesville.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And January 6th definitely comes up in the book because people sort of face that question. I think the key difference is the protesters, by and large, and you can see this even from video footage. You look at video footage from Seattle, very well documented. January 6th, very well documented. And you can see that the energy of that crowd at January 6th, whether it was 51% of the people or 53 or whatever percentage it was that wanted to smash windows and get into that building, that was the prevailing atmosphere, right? And they were willing to bring violence against property and people, right? So we know we had the news waiting for Mike Pence. We had people roaming the halls looking for Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence, wanting to exact their anger and their upset toward those people. What you had in Seattle was, again, 50,000 people committed to nonviolent civil disobedience. So as the police sprayed tear gas at crowds and pepper spray directly into people's eyes, you had no violent reaction from any of those individuals. I've talked to law enforcement, all the agencies I outlined already. None of them have claimed that any of the protesters came at them with violence, right? The way we saw the protesters on January 6th go at law enforcement with violence, right? So you can isolate these 50 people that, again, didn't have any objective to bring violence against people, only against property. And we can debate that and whether or not that's intelligent, that vandalism. But it is vandalism. And they had no plans. And I interviewed these people, part of the Black Bloc. They're in the book. They had no goals whatsoever to bring violence against people. So you see this distinction on January 6th, where there was absolutely prevailing energy to bring violence against people, to hurt law enforcement. And in fact, law enforcement was hurt and in fact died, as we know. And also vandalism against the building, right? And that was the prevailing approach for those protesters. But in Seattle, 50,000 people, prevailing approach is to sit in the street and get your eyes blasted with pepper spray and to remain nonviolent. And I think that's the sort of distinguishing factor.
You mentioned, DW, that the media didn't always do a great job telling the story, but your media, of course, and you're telling this story in your important new book about these demonstrations, 1 week to change the world. You spoke, of course, to the Chomskys and the Ralph Naders of the world, the leftist aristocrats, or the aristocracy, intellectual aristocracy of the leftist movement of the last part of the 20th century in America. But you also spoke to lots of organizers, people like Mike Dolan, Lisa Fithian, Yolanda Sinde. Are there generalizations one can make? I remember an old friend of mine, Eche Temelkuran, a veteran of the Arab Spring, always said about her experience then in Tahrir Square that they were the most exciting times of her life. Many of the people you spoke to, do they remember this period with a romantic nostalgia that this was the one moment in their life where everything seemed possible, kind of almost like 1968?
Yes, a lot of that. Absolutely. A lot of fondness people have for that week, no matter how difficult it was. No sleep, little food, threats of violence around you, danger around you from the police.
Lots of romance. Were there any?
Oh yeah, there were some
so.
There were a few love children came out of Seattle. Couples who came together and have children that were born shortly after, and so that's sort of, in some cases, personal histories of part of the legacy of Seattle, and in fact, some second generations of organizers and protesters out of it. So yeah, absolutely, all kinds of interpersonal squabbles too, right? I mean, I mentioned earlier this sort of coming together of the Direct Action Network, which again was an informal organization of a lot of individual players and small organizations that were really gritty and really focused on shutting down the meetings. But then you also had someone like Mike Dolan, who you referenced, who was part of Ralph Nader's Public Citizen, and was, as he just self-described, sort of, I'm the DC guy, I'm the NGO guy, right? So all those people from the Direct Action Network, the anarchists and the sort of the environmental groups, they viewed someone like Mike Dolan with a lot of suspicion. Why are you here? What do you want to do? What do you want to do with this opportunity to protest, right? So he had to do a lot of work to sort of win over their trust and have them see that he was on the same page. He wanted to shut down the WTO as well. And he was negotiating, sort of messaging that directly to them and powerfully to them, but also more softly to some of the big DC organizations that he was trying to get involved to bring out bodies in the streets, right? A lot of unions, but also big organizations like the Sierra Club, right? Something like the Sierra Club is an organization with a big profile, a lot of connections to political power. And that leadership was very nervous about sort of getting in bed with the Direct Action Network, so to speak, right? Do we want to shut down these meetings? Is that something we really want to do? So that magic of those groups being able to come together and work together and make it happen, what they called sort of this inside-outside strategy, right? Because let's not forget, Mike Dolan, his boss, Lori Wallach, who's a trade specialist, still is, and she was Ralph Nader's right-hand person for so many years. She has a delegate pass. She's going into the WTO meetings. She's trying to sabotage things from the inside, and there were others like her. Medea Benjamin did this as well. Other people did this. So you had this inside-outside game they were playing, and Lori Wallach calls it monkey wrenching, right? Going back and forth and trying to see how you can get the activity in the streets to feed off the activity on the inside of the meetings and vice versa. And that big tent coalition building, I think that's something we're missing in today's world. Everything is so siloed and sort of, we have a lot of purity tests, right? Can you be on our team? Here's 25 questions to answer. And if you get one answer wrong, you're not on the team, right? In Seattle, you had Tom Hayden and Sherrod Brown there, but you also had Pat Buchanan there. Right? This is incredible. These are sort of right-left coalitions that just are unthinkable today. But everyone realized that what the fundamentals were on the line. They couldn't argue about policies if they weren't going to be able to save democracy, if they weren't going to be able to save their voices in how globalization happened. Right? So that was something that people look back on with a lot of fondness and romanticization, and rightly so, that ability to build this big tent coalition. But I will say that Ralph Nader in particular, one of his big gripes about Seattle is that people over-romanticize it, the people who know about it. It's funny, so many people don't remember it, but the people who do remember it really romanticize it. And he gets upset about that a little bit. He's like,
Ralph is anything but a romantic. You mentioned Tom Hayden, one of the founders of this SDS, very much involved in the 1960s. The more you talk about this, DW, the more it reminds me of the events in Chicago in 1968 at the Democratic Convention. Huge violence between the police and demonstrators. Consequence of all that, of course, was the victory of Richard Nixon at the polls in 1968. And we know what happened after that. One of the things, of course, that came out potentially, I guess, of these demonstrations was the election in which Al Gore was defeated by George Bush. Could one say, for all the romanticism and nostalgia for this period, for this moment, that it ultimately resulted in significant political defeat?
I mean, you're right to point out the parallel, I think, between 68 and 99 and sort of the outcomes, the political outcomes, and Nixon and Bush. I think that's really interesting and deserves some more space to sort of think about, because there are some things there in terms of parallels. But I think in terms of political defeat, I think two things have happened at once. I think on the surface, one can see political defeat. A lot of people that were there in Seattle, they said, we succeeded. We stopped the meetings. They didn't reach a new agreement, and we did what we wanted to. But man, in the 25 years since then, I can't say that corporate governance has really slowed down. I can't say that sort of the neoliberal agenda has slowed down. I can't say that globalization as we feared has really slowed down. And I think that that's true. But what you've had boiling under the surface is this upset about the dehumanization of globalization, how it totally discounts the individual worker, the individual human being. I think that's never gone away. And it's reared its head in so many different and ugly ways, in ways that I wish it hadn't, like with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And
although Trump himself would have been, one of the reasons he's so popular is his opposition to NAFTA.
Absolutely,
so he would argue that he was on the side. He might have even shown up at this thing.
Absolutely.
It's all very well talking about dehumanization. It's a very vague notion, DW. You note that there were many different political groups there, from radical anarchists to union members to intellectuals like Chomsky and longtime political activists like Nader. What did people want to? Is there a general alternative to the NAFTA world that was offered in 1999 at Seattle, or was it just noisy protest and opposition to NAFTA, but nothing really offered as an alternative? And what can we learn from it, given that many of the issues and consequences haven't gone away in the 25 years since the protests?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was absolutely alternative models offered up. And this was one of the things I think that frustrated protesters, because journalists kept saying to them, well, you say anti-globalization. We know what you're against, but what are you for? And they said, no, we're telling you what we're for. We're for democracy. And what does that mean? It means letting decisions about how international trade be made by entities other than corporate leadership, right? So maybe they're a stakeholder at the table, but so is civil society, right? So counties and states and nation states should have a say in this, right? This is where sort of democracy has a job to do to push back on globalization and capitalism, right? There's a responsibility there. So there were the International Forum of Globalization. They were doing teach-ins across the country, teach-ins in Seattle, where they talked to people about globalization, where they talked to people about alternative models, right? And we're educating people. Colin Hines is in the book. He was one of the original, he was in Seattle. He was actually there running around with Julia Christie, if you can believe it. It shows you the sort of the scope of people who were there. The actress Julia Christie was running around with Colin the whole week. But Colin was one of the authors of the Green New Deal, which originated in the UK decades ago, right? They were already thinking about this. It's sort of resurfaced now, and it's resurfaced in the US when it fell into the hands of people like AOC in the US and got really excited about it, but it's been around for a while. So people like Colin Hines and his colleagues have been working on alternate models for globalization. And I think that's the key there. There were some people who criticize sort of our technology state and really want to turn to sort of a more agrarian society. Those are a handful of people. The vast majority of the 50,000 people that were there were looking for an alternate model of globalization. They weren't saying no to trade. They understand the reality of how the modern world works, but they wanted to find new models. And yes, new models were being offered. Again, International Forum for Globalization was one very important entity, and the Green New Deal, which was already being shaped in the UK by Colin Hines and a few others. Those were alternative models that were there. And one more thing to tack onto that, sort of this idea of, because I think that goes directly to the idea of dehumanization, right? Getting the individual involved, right? Getting communities involved in how they interact with their state and their country and their world. There are models to make that happen. And I think we need to consider that. I think that one of the key organizers in Seattle, he told me, Twitter has killed organizing. It's just killed organizing because we mistook it as like the whole enchilada. But really, it's just one tool. It's one tool in the toolbox. Sure, you can organize 2,000 events across the globe in one afternoon and have tons of people turn out and make that happen. But can you build lasting campaigns? That's why you need some kind of a marriage between the tools of the internet that are available to us, also getting in the same room and looking at each other eye to eye and working out issues. And that's where sort of that warehouse that they rented in Seattle, and they had the spokes council meeting. They called that warehouse the Convergence Center. What a great name, right? Convergence Center, that idea of all these people coming together. And if we lose that ability to get in the same room and to organize on a local level, and I'm talking geographically here, the communities we live in, if we lose the ability to do that kind of organizing, it doesn't matter what we do on social media and the internet, it's not going to build any lasting campaigns.
Yeah, it's interesting, although I'm not convinced necessarily on the democratic quality. 50,000 activists went to Seattle. That doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that most people want to, for better or worse, be involved with this. Let's fast forward 25 years later. We have, in some ways, a similar series of protests around the country, this time associated with Palestine, lots of demonstrations on campus, for and against, particularly against the American involvement with Israel and Gaza. What can we learn today, finally, DW, about what Seattle taught us, particularly for activists wanting to shape American foreign and perhaps economic policy in the second quarter of the 21st century?
There are so many lessons in this book that speak directly to that question. In some ways, I almost thought of the book as like a handbook, right, for activists, sort of a case study for how to make it work. So many lessons. But I think the thing that I would pull out is this, that any kind of protest without civil disobedience is totally impotent. It can't do anything. And history tells us this. I mean, everyone from Gandhi to Rosa Parks to John Lewis, so many people across the world have told us and shown us, demonstrated that civil disobedience is necessary to affect change. But you have to dial down a little bit beyond that. There are two qualities that civil disobedience has to have in order to be effective. It has to be nonviolent, and it has to have practical objectives, tactical objectives to reach practical outcomes, right? So in Seattle, 50,000 people getting tear gas and pepper sprayed, remaining nonviolent, and they knew what their objective was: block the intersections and shut down the meetings. And that had a practical outcome. And you have to envision outcomes beyond media exposure, beyond sort of getting people's attention. That's important, but you want to seek practical outcomes, right? Don't get off the bus, right? Get across the bridge, right? Go get salt. Gandhi went to go get salt, right? Have a practical outcome. So nonviolence and practical outcome for civil disobedience, that's your recipe, I think, for protests that can affect change and campaigns that can be sustained over time.
Well, D.W. I was going to say Griffith. It's not. It's D.W. Gibson. I almost fell into that trap again. The author of a really interesting new book, 1 week to change the world. The world didn't change, but some of the issues, I think, back from the 1999 Seattle WTO protests are still around today. I want to thank you so much, DW. Best of luck with the book, and best of luck with your protests in the rest of the century. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
The voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, the truth seeker.